On the morning of July 24th, 1915, a passenger ship rolled onto its side in the Chicago River. It was still tied to the dock. More than 2,500 people had boarded for a company picnic, and in less than 5 minutes, 844 of them were dead, trapped in 20 feet of water while the city watched from the wharf.
No storm, no collision, no open water. To understand how that is possible, you have to know what kind of ship this was. What had just been bolted onto it in the name of safety? And who was standing on its decks when it went over? The people on board worked for Western Electric, the company that built America's telephones. Its Hawthorne Works plant on the edge of Chicago employed tens of thousands, many of them immigrants from Bohemia, Poland, and Hungary, whole families working at the same factory. Once a year, the company threw a lake excursion and picnic, and for workers earning factory wages, it was the social event of the summer. Employees bought tickets, pressed their best clothes, and brought their children. Before dawn on July 24th, thousands of them arrived at the south bank of the Chicago River, downtown, between the Clark and LaSalle Street bridges. 5 steamers were chartered to carry them across Lake Michigan to the picnic grounds in Indiana. The first ship at the dock was a fast, elegant excursion steamer called the Eastland. Boarding opened around 6:30. By 7:10, more than 2,500 people were aboard, and the gangplank was pulled in. What the passengers crowding the decks did not know was that the Eastland had a reputation on the lakes. She was built for speed, narrow, shallow in the water, tall above it. That shape made her quick and unstable. In 1904, she had nearly rolled over with a full load of passengers. She listed badly again in 1906 and again in 1912. Sailors talked about her. She was a ship that had been warning people for 11 years. Then, in 1912, the Titanic sank, and the world demanded lifeboats for everyone. In March 1915, President Wilson signed a new maritime safety law, and that summer, the Eastland was carrying the result. 11 lifeboats, 37 life rafts, life jackets for every soul aboard, tons of new equipment, and almost all of it stored high on the upper decks. On paper, the ship had never been safer. In the water, she had never been more top-heavy. The one thing holding her upright was a system of ballast tanks in the hull, tanks the crew flooded or emptied to keep her balanced. There was no reliable way to measure exactly how much water was in them. The crew worked by feel. On the morning of the picnic, feel was not enough. As passengers streamed aboard, the ship leaned toward the dock, then away from it. The crew opened valves to flood the tanks on the high side, and for several critical minutes, the water barely came. The list to port grew. At about 7:23, river water began pouring in through the open gangways on the low side. Crew shouted for passengers to move to the other rail. It was too late. At 7:28, the Eastland rolled over, 20 feet from the wharf, in water shallow enough to stand a house in. For the people on the open decks, the world tilted and then simply turned sideways. Many of them could climb onto the exposed hull, where they stood in the rain as if on a beached whale. A tugboat pulled alongside, and passengers walked across it to the dock. But below decks, hundreds of people, families sheltering from the drizzle, children, women in heavy summer dresses, were thrown into a tangle of furniture and rising water, with the floor now a wall. Bystanders hurled crates and ladders into the river. Workers came running with cutting torches and opened holes in the steel hull, pulling people out one by one. A Western Electric nurse named Helen Repa climbed aboard within minutes and spent the day treating survivors and wiring department stores for blankets. 844 people died. 228 of them were teenagers. 58 were babies and small children. 70% of the dead were under 25. The average age was 23. Some families were wiped out entirely. There was no one left to claim the bodies. A National Guard armory nearby became a temporary morgue, with the dead laid out in rows of 85 for relatives to walk. More passengers died on the Eastland than on the Titanic, and it happened in the middle of America's second largest city, in front of hundreds of witnesses, to employees of one of its most famous companies. So what happened to the men responsible? Within days, federal charges were filed against the ship's owners, its captain, its chief engineer, and the government inspectors who had certified it safe. The owners hired the most famous defense lawyer in America, Clarence Darrow. It worked. A judge ruled the disaster an accident, and no one was ever criminally tried for the deaths of 844 people. The civil lawsuits crawled on for 2 more decades. When the courts finally settled on a cause in the 1930s, they pinned the blame on one man, the chief engineer who had operated the ballast tanks. He had been dead since 1919. And under maritime law, the ship's owners were liable only for the value of the wreck itself, about $46,000, which went to creditors, not families. The people who lost children, parents, entire households received nothing. The Eastland itself was pulled upright, sold, renamed, and spent 30 years as a Navy training ship before being cut up for scrap. The Titanic got books, films, and memorials. The Eastland got a lawsuit that outlived the man it blamed. Its victims were factory workers and immigrants. No millionaires, no famous names. And for most of a century, the deadliest day in Chicago's history was barely marked at all. The river still flows past the spot, between 2 bridges, in the middle of downtown. 20 feet deep.